So the next speaker, Arvind, is the NBX Assistant Professor of Computer Science at MIT in the Department of Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence. He leads the MIT Visualization Group, which use data visualization to study intelligence augmentation and how software systems amplify cognition and creativity. His works have been recognized by NSF Careers Award, Google Search Scholar Award, and Best Paper Awards. Visual, and by visualization toolkits and systems, and he developed with the collaborators and widely used in the industry, including Apple, Google, and Microsoft. In 2018 and 2020, he served as a co-editor of Distill, an academic journal devoted to clarity in machine learning and research. Do a round of applause for our next guest.
Wonderful. It's a delight to be able to speak with you all today. As he mentioned, my name is Arvind. I lead the visualization group at MIT CSAIL. So I particularly enjoyed the provocative talk that ran right before me, and hopefully we'll have a chance to chat about that some more. And so what my group is primarily known for is building a lot of visualization software, namely things like Vega, Vega Lite, and Lyra, which dashboards are some of the things we do, but we tend to go beyond dashboards as well. But that's not going to be the topic of my talk today. Instead, given that this is a conference about citizen science and citizen scientists, I thought I would spend some time talking about another project in my group where we've been studying the way the data visualization has been used among citizen scientists on social media to talk about the pandemic. And in particular, I want to note that this is work that has really been driven by Crystal Lee, who I've highlighted here, who is a PhD student in my group. And she really led just a massive team of folks, including other PhD students, lots of undergraduates, as well as collaborators of ours in the anthropology department at MIT. So if we cast our minds back over this past time period, starting really with back in February or March of last year, we were kind of inundated by visualizations about the state of COVID-19, right? Almost every single day, it felt like there was some new visualization, be that on the front page of the New York Times showing us case rates, that simulation on the Washington Post that many of us might remember about the effects of social distancing. And of course, flattening the curve, which now is almost sort of synonymous with, I think, the pandemic for many of us, which was probably one of the visualizations I can most think of as having gone viral and actually kind of impacting some actual real world change. And then my favorite one out of these, this is probably the first time I've seen a data visualization being memed, right? So this was a chart from John Burns Murdoch at the Financial Times and showing the case rates, in various countries around the world. And some user, I don't know, on Reddit or Twitter, went and highlighted all the countries where case rates were spiking and labeled them as countries that don't drink bubble tea or boba, and all the countries that were doing a good job kind of flattening the curve as those countries that drank boba tea. And so, looking at this, there was a lot of reflection from a number of folks who call this, data visualization's breakthrough moment. And there was kind of a collective intuition that, data, more data, bigger data, interactive data-driven models, data literacy, these sorts of things were what were gonna lead us out of the pandemic, right? If we just got more data into more people's hands, made it more accessible, allowed people to gain some insight from that data, we would all start to do the right things and we would flatten the curve and be on our way. And so, what we wanted to do in my group is just study this question a little bit more, right? Was data visualization having a breakthrough moment? Was the kind of critical building block in making progress for the pandemic really an issue of data? And so what we did was kind of take a two-pronged approach. We wanted to kind of, like I said, study this intuition a little bit. And so what we decided to do was a little bit of computational, social science and digital ethnography. And in particular, what I want to call out here is that we didn't start, I have quite a provocative title as well, how COVID skeptics, use data visualization. We didn't actually start with that frame at all. Rather, we followed a methodology called grounded theory, where we formed our research questions by seeing what the data was telling us, if you will. So as we spent time on these two social networks, Twitter and Facebook, looking at the data, we kind of iteratively formed our research question. And so I just want to walk you through the sorts of things we found, starting with our analysis of Twitter. So on Twitter, what we did was, just plug into the Twitter fire hose and look for all the tweets that made some mention of the pandemic, so COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, and then some sort of data-related keyword: visualization, data, charts, trends, exponential, etc. That whole repository yielded about 500,000 tweets. So this was for the first 6 months, just the first 6 months of the pandemic. And in those 500,000 tweets, there were about 41,000 visualizations that we collected. So with all this data, of course, the first place that we turn to is who is talking about all of this data and all of these visions on Twitter. So this is just a very rough, it's probably not super clear graph of the people talking about this on Twitter. The nodes are just users, handles that came up. So you can see, Joe Biden, real Donald Trump, so on and so forth. And they're sized by, how many interactions they're having with other people in the data set. So that's what these edges represent, right? So two people, two nodes are connected together if they've either retweeted each other, quote tweeted each other, replied to one another, etc. And the nodes are sized based on how many of those sorts of interactions they've had in this data set, or the degree of those nodes. And the final thing that this graph is coding is basically communities that we detected just using an off-the-shelf algorithm. And that's what the colors encode here. And so what I wanted to just pull out to start with the top 4 networks by size, so the number of people and the numbers of interactions that were occurring. So perhaps unsurprisingly, given that it's Twitter, the top 2 largest networks were, US-centric for the mainstream, the right wing. And for each of these networks, we calculated, as percentages of all the tweets in our data set, how many of the tweets in these little sub-networks were original, so original thoughts that people had, and how many of them were basically retweeting someone else in that network. So you can see, for the mainstream, there were about 22% of the tweets we had collected were original, and then 73% were retweets. And for the right wing, it was sort of 45 and 75%. The third largest network was, users associated with Great Britain. So Nicola Sturgeon, for instance, John Byrne Murdoch, a variety of other, entities in the UK. And then, kind of shockingly to us, the 4th largest network, again, we did not look for this in the data specifically, this is just what emerged from the data, was a network of people who were otherwise skeptical about the pandemic. And what I mean by that is it's not that they deny that the pandemic was a thing, but rather, a lot of their tweets were of the nature that our response to the pandemic has been overblown. The pandemic is maybe not as serious as we think it is. We don't need to have things like mask mandates. We don't need to be, locking down the economy, closing schools, etc. And so some users, in this network have since been banned, like Alex Berenson. And what you can see as part of the sort of very high level summary statistics that we've collected is that these COVID skeptics aren't any more insular or any more isolated as a network than, some of the mainstream ones, right? As a percentage, their original tweets are in the ballpark of everyone else's, and they're retweeting each other by just about the same amount, right? So they're not some isolated set of kooks. And in fact, if this was a little bit clearer, you'd see there's actually kind of a lot of connections, a lot of edges between them and other networks in play there. Now, besides the people, the other thing we did was actually analyze the visualizations that they were talking about on Twitter. We ran some machine learning around it. I don't want to get into the details, and then plotted a data visualization to get a summary of, what the different kinds of chart types they were talking about. So you can see, here are all the line charts everyone was discussing, the area charts, bar charts, so on and so forth. And again, if we look at, those top 4 networks on the visualizations they were looking at, this is maybe not as clear using this projector, but what I'm hoping you might be able to see is that, for the most part, the COVID skeptics, are using the same visual forms that everyone else is, right? They're using line charts, area charts, bar charts, maps, tables, etc. They're not doing anything particularly different. And moreover, these circles, each of them representing a single visualization, these circles are sized by how much engagement those visualizations saw on Twitter. So the larger the circle, the more number of people retweeted it or responded to it or quote tweeted it and so on and so forth. And you can see that, all these 4 top networks, they all saw, 1 or 2 or a handful of really viral visualizations. But one thing this projector makes really clear is kind of the average baseline engagement that the COVID skeptics saw was higher, right, than many of the other more mainstream networks. Just a lot more of that visualization is visible to you. And so you might be wondering, well, Arvind, come on, that's probably because if they're COVID skeptics, they're, maybe they're using chart junk, they're visually embellishing things, they're provoking outrage, people are dunking on them on Twitter. This is stuff we know about. Well, so here are just 3 visualizations from our much larger data set to give you a flavor of the sorts of things these folks were retweeting or tweeting, right? They're not visualizations that are totally off the reservation, right? They're not crazy visualizations. They're not visually embellished. They're no obviously erroneous things. If anything, they're actually pretty polished, sophisticated charts, right? So the one on the right, for instance, is actually remarkable in how detailed it is, including the amount of kind of annotation that this person is doing to help their reader understand how to read this chart. It's the sort of thing that oftentimes a lot of data journalists say is important to their practice, right? Doing a lot of annotation to help their reader through. Similarly, on the left-hand side here is actually a screenshot from Our World in Data, which was one of the most reputable sources of data about the pandemic. And in this case, someone skeptical has used the same chart, but in this case, telling a different story with it, right? So what is actually going on here? Before I get to that, I should say that all of our data we've actually made, or not all, a lot of our data we've made kind of open. We've produced an interactive dashboard that you all can pull up and just sort of pour through this data that we've been talking about. But the question is, we've gotten this very broad, high-level overview, this broad sense of what is happening on Twitter. How might we get close to understand particular conversations that these COVID skeptics are having with data and with visualization? And so as part of that, what we did was conducted some digital ethnography. So by that, I mean that we spent 6 months lurking on 5 Facebook groups associated with, sentiments around anti-masking, about, lockdowns, school closures, etc. And we spent hundreds and hundreds of hours poring over the conversations these folks were having, the videos they were sharing, the live streams they were hosting, etc., to analyze what was happening. And all of our data associated with this as well, we have made open and easily explorable for all of you as part of that same interactive narrative. And what I want to do is just pull out, 3 kind of recurring themes that I think are often treated as the hallmarks of citizen science, generally speaking. So the first is kind of an emphasis on original content. And I think oftentimes, we've heard about this idea that we've got a distrust in our institutions, right? Polling around, politicians, around the media, around faith organizations, et cetera, is at an all-time low. And in fact, we absolutely see this play out even in the context of something very grassroots like, understanding the pandemic. So in particular, group members in these Facebook groups take it upon themselves to sort of follow the data, quote unquote, and they value kind of unmediated access to that information. Group administrators in particular, even impose bans on themselves to not consume news from more mainstream organizations so that they can kind of quote unquote, keep their analysis unclouded. So they don't want their analysis to be clouded by what the mainstream audience is telling them. Now, outside content is generally prohibited, and moderators, oftentimes encourage their members to make their own chart and share those charts, by prominent members to a larger audience. And what this often has a result of doing is filling an information gap, because not every country, not every locality has the resources to really stand up, really careful data gathering. And so these folks in these Facebook groups often play that role of doing the data collection, doing the data interpretation, et cetera. And this yields a very collaborative effort where group members are often providing different kinds of tutorials of how to access government data. And these tutorials often become a place where they start to do some of this editorializing as well. So for instance, this quote here, the data that you can download from the state of Georgia Health Department is completely worthless. Is something that someone was saying just as they were hosting a live stream tutorial about how to kind of download and analyze this data. As part of what was happening in these Facebook groups, there's sort of a lot of heated debate about what data is being collected, which metrics matter, and things like that. And in particular, one of the things that was most hotly debated was what we should be measuring, right? Which is actually a pretty sophisticated thing for folks to be discussing in these Facebook groups, right? There's a tendency, I think, for us to think that, these are maybe data illiterate people who need more training in media literacy, data analysis, but they're actually having pretty detailed discussions, as you can see here on the right-hand side, about what numbers like deaths or cases mean. And in particular, they really like deaths to start with because they think deaths are a pretty definitive thing, right? You are dead or not. Versus cases, they were like, well, people are changing the definition of what a case means, right? The numbers of cases might change because we're increasing testing. Or, maybe the number of cases aren't that significant because, as this person says here, they're also counting asymptomatic transmission as part of that case number. So how seriously should we be treating that? But even deaths really, are still a problematic statistic or a measure for them, because you might remember oftentimes there was a lot of analysis around excess deaths. And, people note that this is also, and to some degree, from their point of view, a metric that was sort of invented to tell a story about the state of the pandemic. So here, for example, someone says you can simply subtract the current death tally from the typical value for this time of the year and attribute the difference to COVID. Because of the actions of our government, we're actually causing excess as well. And what's particularly problematic with this notion of excess deaths is when it doesn't match their lived experience. And when it doesn't, people start to attribute that to sort of scaremongering that is being driven up by the media or the politicians to impose sort of lockdowns. The final thing that I wanted to highlight is this idea that for a lot of these folks in these Facebook groups, they think of science with a capital S not as an institution, right, with scientists in their academic ivory towers, but rather something that everybody engages as a process. And in particular, I think this is a place where maybe some of these folks are ahead of, quote unquote, scientists themselves. So one of the things in computer science and data we're often encouraging researchers to do is be reflexive, right? Identify sort of where you're situated and what context you're situated, what your, point of view, framing of the world is bringing to that problem. And these folks are sort of doing that already. Right, they're doing that sort of intuitively rather than being told to do that. So this person says, I've never claimed not to have any biases. Of course I'm biased, I'm human. I cannot imagine ever reading something like that in a scientific publication, right? Most scientists, I would say, don't have that level of clarity and like to think of ourselves, I don't know why I'm distancing myself from that, like to think of ourselves as very dispassionate individuals that can think of things objectively, right? And these folks are realizing that that is not true. And finally, they're seeing how this scientific endeavor that they're engaging in bolsters their social, unity, their social cohesion, view it very much as part of their, civic fabric. So here someone is saying, regardless of your political party, it is incumbent on all of us to ask our elected officials for the data they use to make decisions. I am speaking to you as a neighbor to request the data. And the goal of many of these groups is to develop a network of well-informed citizens who are analyzing the data. And the discussions that happen in these Facebook groups often resemble what we would consider to be peer review. So someone will post, a piece of analysis, a visualization, and in the comments, the folks will weigh in to offer feedback, to critique it, to improve it, and things like that. And often longtime followers will give small tutorials to new users and are extremely willing to help them, interpret graphs, to lead them through analyses. And the back and forth really, creates this really interesting community filled with kind of constructive feedback and back and forth. And so based on all of these readings, that's why we've thought, these increasing calls for more data literacy, we need to go and educate people. Data literacy is part of the problem. That doesn't feel like the right thing, right? And it can sometimes even backfire in that, this idea of asking people to question things, follow the data, think for yourselves, can actually lead to weaponization of skepticism and critical thinking. And oftentimes, and I am just as guilty of this, when we think of building tools for data analysis, for data manipulation, we often use the term democratization, right? We want to make this possible for everybody to do. And I think a very interesting question for tool builders like my group to think about is how that democratization process is maybe helping to lower the amount of expertise people need to do some of this analysis, right? How are some of these tools maybe helping folks to engage in this sort of analysis that somehow leads them down, a path that is outside of kind of scientific orthodoxy, if you will. And so we're still in my group in a stage of, where do we go from here? And I don't necessarily have kind of concrete takeaways for you, except recommending, I think, these three really excellent books, which offer a variety of sort of pragmatic and philosophical takeaways. So pragmatically, calling bullshit is just fantastic. Talks about ways of good debunking that you can do. Sometimes you want to mix in humor and that can work really effectively, but might backfire. And then Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, as well as Data Action by Sarah Williams, helps us understand that there are more systematic, systems levels of things at play. And that as individuals, while we do have some opportunity, we need to sort of think about the sort of global context as well. And so with that, I'll note that this work was published as a research paper, as well as that online interactive article at that URL. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for your talk. Are there any questions from the audience?
So when you investigate these skeptic groups online, are there occasionally people who look at the data and they say, actually, guys, we were wrong, I'm out. The mainstream people were correct. Like, to what extent do they break out as a side effect of this natural process?
That's a great question. To my knowledge, I don't think they, part of that ban on the mainstream news was I think, preventing that sort of breakthrough from happening. I think it would be really interesting if that ever were to happen, but I also think that a lot of times their priors are to sort of start by distrusting those insights that the mainstream are propagating, and so it's interesting how they start from different stances and maybe never quite get there.
You talked about at the end, basically giving people more tools can give them more power to go down bad paths, or however you want to define it. But then the flip side of it, not building tools for people is probably bad and not good. So how do you guys think about actually approaching that problem from kind of practical progress perspective?
Yeah, I think that is, for me, the question that has been keeping me up ever since we, put out the first draft of this like a year ago. And to be honest, I don't yet know what that line is, right? So we're still doing a lot of tool building in my group. And I think part of the line is figuring out how you start to bake in, more of what looks like domain expertise in these tools, right? Where, not COVID specifically, well, actually, even with COVID, these metrics, folks are sort of, in these Facebook groups, treating them as kind of, equally viable, equally plausible ways of analyzing these phenomena, right? Deaths, cases, excess deaths, et cetera. And people are just kind of using them interchangeably. They understand, kind of the semantics associated with those metrics, but oftentimes what an expert is able to do is figure out which metric to use when, why, etc. And that's the sort of flip that a lot of citizen scientists aren't yet able to make, unsurprisingly, because they're not domain experts. And so how might the tools, shift from being general purpose tools that say you can build a data visualization, do data analysis for any domain, right? Just plug in your CSV, hook up your backend database, and now all visualizations are the same. To instead saying, well, actually, you're analyzing public health data. These are the things you need to take into account. You're analyzing climate data. These are the things you need to take into account.